Hello and welcome to Sound Strategic. I'm Meia. In today's episode, we'll take a look at artificial intelligence and NATO. AI has been considered the biggest technological challenge facing the alliance's nations and a key emerging threat to strategic stability and collective security as allies' adversaries invest in AI technology of their own. NATO is making considerable efforts, therefore, to develop its own artificial intelligence strategy and policy as part of a wider strategy to harness the benefits of emerging technologies. Here to help me unpack the role that the Alliance can play in coordinating and accelerating the adoption of AI and establishing interoperability standards and norms within NATO, I'm joined today by Erica Pepe and Franz-Stefan. Erica is the IISS coordinator for research and the analyst for conflict security and development at the IISS. She supports the coordination of research programs and managerial, fundraising, and outreach activities. She also conducts research for the Conflict Security and Development Program, as well as the Defense and Military Analysis Program, and contributes research support to the IISS's Armed Conflict Survey and the Military Balance and Military Balance Plus database. Prior to joining the IISS, Erica previously worked at the NATO Defense College and European Parliament. In addition to holding a master's degree in international relations from Lewis University, she holds qualifications from the University of Oxford's Artificial Intelligence program, as well as the LSE's Cyber Law course. Franz isn't new to Sound Strategic, but for those who don't know him yet, he is the Research Fellow for Cyber, Space, and Future Conflict. At the Institute, Franz focuses on the future of war, strategic technologies, European and Asian security, as well as great power conflict. Prior to joining the IISS, he held various positions at the East-West Institute, the Project on National Security Reform, and the National Defense University. He conducted field research in Afghanistan and Iraq, where, among other things, he embedded with the Afghan National Army, NATO forces, and Kurdish militias. And if that wasn't enough, he's also reported from a wide range of countries and conflict zones as a journalist. So welcome on the show, Erica, and welcome back, Franz.
Hi, thank you very much for having us.
Great to be back on the show, Meia.
Erica, let's start broadly on the topic of AI. What is it and what isn't it? And what definition does NATO use for AI?
Thank you very much for the introduction, Meia. I think that talking about the role that NATO could play in setting the standards for the use of AI for defense and security is indeed an important conversation to have. But before we go more into details on that, I wanted to take a step back and start saying what is AI and why AI is important for NATO. So the term AI, artificial intelligence, has become popular in the recent years, but it is not new. And it was mentioned for the first time by John McCarthy, an American computer scientist, back in 1956. But since then, there have been many different definitions for AI that changed over the years, also according to the different phases of the development of the technology. And without going into the philosophical dissertation of what is intelligence and what is an intelligent machine, I will give you NATO's definition of AI that comes from the US Department of Defense AI strategy, which describes AI as referring to the ability of machines to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. For example, learning from experience. And so differently from traditional computers with AI, after the initial training of the algorithms, no further programming is done by humans to enable these machines to perform their tasks. So basically, AI is about building machines that can learn like human brains do. And machines can then match or surpass human performance in many tasks, such as finding trends in large amount of data. And maybe not everyone realizes that in recent years, AI has gained a constant presence in our day-to-day life because we interact with AI-enabled systems by using face recognition to unlock our smartphones, or when we choose a movie which has been recommended to us on Netflix, or when we see a product recommendation on Amazon, when we interact with smart personal assistants like Alexa and Siri, and in many other ways. So it is not a surprise that countries around the world have realized the potential of AI also for security and defense, and that NATO allies are now striving to retain the technological edge and accelerate research and development of military applications of AI, because this could help achieve a military advantage at the tactical, operational, and strategic level.
So we've heard quite a lot about the transformative, if not revolutionary, potential that AI might have for civilian and defense industries, as Erica has just said. But what are some of the drawbacks of AI?
Thank you, Maya. That's a great question. But first of all, let me perhaps quickly build on what Erica just said. And I think generally there's definitely hype surrounding artificial intelligence at the moment, and this is not exclusively really just within NATO, but it really goes to society in general. It's almost this Deus ex machina device that seems to be the solution to all the world's problems at the moment. So, of course, in the private sector, we're also seeing a proliferation of AI products out there. And I remember reading an article in the Financial Times a couple of months ago that indicates that around 40% of artificial intelligence startups in Europe that really advertise AI programs don't really use any AI in the product. So in one sense, that really speaks to the loose definition of AI, artificial intelligence, but also highlights some technical illiteracy, I think. But I think it's really important that when we talk about artificial intelligence and NATO, what we really are talking about is machine learning algorithms, right? And these are algorithms essentially that use statistics to guess patterns in massive amounts of data. And that's essentially it to a large degree. So it's not really a super weapon. It's not really a panacea for all of the world's problems, but it has a very specific purpose and a very specific task. And I think what's really important when we talk about the limitations of artificial intelligence, or rather machine learning, right? I think it's important to understand that machine learning can correlate data, cannot infer causality. In other words, machine learning is really all about correlation and not causation. And this is really a problem when it comes to trust, essentially. Why? Because generally you need causality for explanations, right? And you can't really explain if you don't really have the cause and effect relationship to describe a phenomenon or like an event out there. You sort of really have a trust problem at the end of the day. Because if you don't precisely know why artificial intelligence comes up with a certain explanation or prediction, rather, because machine learning is really mostly about predictions, right? If this is just a magical box, you're likely to trust artificial intelligence less. And so I think because of this lack of trust, and there are many other reasons out there, but just to singularly focus on trust, I think as long as this problem is not solved in one way or the other, AI is not going to be as widely accepted within the armed forces of NATO for some of the more delicate tasks out there. For example, decision support for senior or military commanders in general about the use of force, which is really a crucial component when you look at doctrinal documents among NATO forces, and in particular the United States and the UK, to set the of decision support in AI. As long as this trust issue is not resolved, I think it's going to be fairly limited where we will see AI. And I think in the short term, that is in the next couple of years, I think it's mostly going to be confined to logistics, for example, which is hugely important, of course, for any military. And then intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, where it's really about processing data through machine learning algorithm and turning it into actionable intelligence. And then also in this field of predictive maintenance of military equipment and facilities. And only in the long term, I think, once we solve this trust issue, will we see command and control support, more autonomous platforms, and then unmanned aerial autonomous vehicles and so forth, all that stuff that you hear about when you talk about the future of conflict and so forth. And then, of course, human machine teaming as well. So I think generally when we talk about AI, I think NATO really should move away a bit more from this debate about lethal autonomous systems, or as they're colloquially known, right, killer robots, and more directly embrace where AI can really make a difference, such as in logistics and predictive maintenance, just because of this trust issue that really presents some inherent limitations to its use.
So the killer robot argument is premature, you'd argue.
I don't think it's premature. I think there are some political sensitivities that need to be taken into account by many NATO member states, particularly by Germany, for example, where there is going to be a huge political backlash against the use of lethal autonomous systems. Right? I mean, there's this big debate about armed drones right now, armed unmanned aerial vehicles. And I think this debate should be had, but at the same time, I think NATO would do very well to decouple this from where artificial intelligence can make a difference right now. And that is not really when it comes to in the field of lethal autonomous systems and killer robot. That's really much more in the field of logistics and predictive maintenance, in my opinion.
Erica.
I agree with Franz that there is a lot of skepticism about AI because in the past, sometimes too much optimism has led to unrealistic predictions of what AI would be capable to achieve in the future. But I also think that in the recent years, there have been significant progress to the advancement in technology and also the availability of big data and also computer processing power. And so there are many potential for the use of AI already, and it has actually already been used in many ways. But obviously, as Franz mentioned, there are also many challenges and risks to be addressed. And as also he mentioned, there is the problem of the trust. So the which is probably related to the algorithm explainability. So because of how machine learning algorithms work, it is difficult and sometimes impossible to replicate a decision reached by a machine and so identify the reasons why a machine made a specific decision. And of course, when algorithms are deployed to make life-changing decisions, the theme of why the machine made a decision becomes really important. And this raises important ethical questions about whether AI-enabled autonomous machines can be held accountable for mistakes or maybe for collateral damages. And so as Franz was saying, that the idea of using AI-based weapons such as AI-powered drones and AI-powered autonomous weapon systems, it is appealing. But on the other hand, it is appealing for government, but it creates a lot of concerns when you take humans out of the loop and let algorithms to decide. And if we made an extreme example, there is the story of Stanislav Petrov that has widely circulated in the recent years. In 1983, Petrov was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, an officer on duty in a bases near Moscow, where the the Soviet Union's early warning system detected the 5 American missiles had been launched from the United States and were heading toward the Soviet Union. So Petrol has some doubts, did not trust the computer readouts, so decided not to pass the information up the chain of command as per protocol, which would have made a strike against the United States almost certain. And in the end, he was right. It was a false alarm. And so one person prevented an accidental nuclear war that would kill millions of people. And so we could wonder what would happen if the decision to respond to the attack was made by AI systems. And so there is a huge debate on this topic with thousands of experts warning about the threat of an arms race, military artificial intelligence, and calling for a ban on autonomous weapons. But and also this includes also the United Nations Secretary General and many other people. But the public debate is much focused on lethal autonomous weapon systems, but it is not only that, and the ethical concerns are raised for AI in general, and not only for autonomous weapons, but also for ensuring, for example, the algorithms are unbiased. The public debate is much focused on lethal autonomous weapon systems, but nonetheless, ethical concerns are raised for AI in general, not only for autonomous weapons. For example, for ensuring the algorithms are unbiased. And these ethical concerns have been addressed by the US Department of Defense and will be addressed also by NATO.
You've both talked about the motivations behind NATO's continued focus, or NATO's enhanced focus on AI and the potential it holds for the alliance. But I'm just wondering, why does it care about it now? I mean, AI is hardly a new technology, hardly a new application or way of manipulating data and gathering analysis. So what has been the momentum behind this decision and this strategy now?
In a nutshell, I believe that this progressive and growing in importance of AI for NATO, it is for three main reasons. First of all, because of the potential in the future of this technology, but also because allies, adversaries are investing in AI. And so there is an urgency for allies to remain strategically relevant and technological prepared for the future of conflicts, and so be able to defend from these potential threats, and also create an alternative, so a Western alternative to standards and norms for AI. And on that, I think NATO wants and can have a role in the coordination of allies' efforts and in setting the standard. Although it is not easy because obviously NATO's membership is wide, and at top level, common approach to AI might not be agreed on all the aspects of the issues. And so this could hinder the ability of the allies to leverage synergies among themselves and across sectors. And not always NATO has been successful in establishing standards and make members to comply. And so reaching an agreement on a very complicated matter like this, obviously it is difficult. These are the reasons why NATO is now putting more focus on AI.
So you've mentioned the fact that adversaries are focusing on AI as well, and that's one of the main motivations for NATO. You know, we've talked a lot about the amount of money and resources that countries like China, for example, have put into their own AI capabilities, both at home and for civilian and military purposes. In that sense, do we think that NATO is behind the curve? And if we do want to describe this as an AI race, which I know that we might have some issues with that language, is NATO in a position to catch up and actually fast track its policies and its strategies?
Well, I just wanted to perhaps also build on the last point that Erica mentioned, and then maybe connect it to your question, your current question, and that is really, I mean, you mentioned a crucial component why artificial intelligence is so prominent now in national security thinking, in the transatlantic community among NATO countries in general, and that is on the one hand China, on the other hand it's Russia. It's we have entered this new age of power competition with China and Russia. I mean, the self-proclaimed age of great power competition, unilaterally declared by the United States, but NATO has been picking it up, and it found its way into documents in the UK and other European NATO member states, of course. But I think the original idea was really one at the operational level for when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence, and that is this idea that China in particular at the operational level and tactical level is deploying so-called A2AD systems that really will prevent freedom of maneuver of US forces in a future conflict with China. And the idea here was really to disable those A2AD complexes, which mostly really was long-range air defense systems, and really to deal with the missile threat that China poses in East Asia, and then to a different degree also Russia. It was really transposed, the Chinese A2AD concept was really transposed upon Russia, and therefore it sort of made it vicariously also into Europe, right? But the idea here was really to create use artificial intelligence in a way to break through this A2AD bubble. And the way how you do that is really use artificial intelligence in order to gain what is in US doctrine and NATO doctrine often called information superiority, information dominance. That is, you have more information faster than your adversary, and therefore you're also able to react faster. And by doing things faster, essentially hitting him first, that is your enemy, your adversary, you gain an advantage in the battle space. And this concept has been around for many decades. It keeps on popping up, like in the early 2000s. The United States military tried to implement a similar concept. At least the US Army tried to do that, and it failed for various reasons, including technical issues, but also financial problems when it comes to this, when it came to this particular project. But I think the idea here was really mostly about finding a way to deal with this new military threat posed by China and Russia. And now, of course, China is developing also, or is one of the leading powers when it came to when it comes to artificial intelligence. But I think I would completely disagree that there is an artificial intelligence race out there, or that China is taking the lead, or that NATO and the United States are falling behind. Why? Because at the end of the day, it's really all about data, and it's about the right data. It doesn't matter if China leads in the commercial sector and is spying on its own population and collecting data about the behavior of its population, because you can't really use it in a military situation. Because what does it really tell you if you know the shopping behavior, or the walking patterns of like Chinese citizens in a certain town in China, right? When it comes to using that data for any sort of advantage in a future battle space, right? So I think it's really important to focus on the issue of data, to get good data and to get the right amount of data. And here, I think NATO and the United States still have an advantage, in my opinion.
Interesting. Erica.
Obviously, we talk about Russia because they're making plans to automate its military systems. Although, if you want to learn more about that, we also have recently published a IISS, Russian's military modernization dossier, and we also talk about China. But as Franz was saying, there is concern about China's role, but the concern is also spread around, also because the U.S. Congress, for example, has recently published a report and expecting China to become to surpass the United States as the world's AI superpower within a decade. So obviously there is much concern for these countries. Despite all that Franz said about the data and availability, but I think that there's also something that should be mentioned here, that it is not just about China and Russia, but a matter of concern. It is that the AI technology, once it's developed, there is the risk that this becomes available to other states, threatening the international order, and also non-state actors. For example, weaponized drones can be easily built and used, and in the near future, anyone could possibly find deep fakes algorithms and download them as easy as a PDF from internet, and use deepfakes and other algorithms to as a destabilizing factor for the international order. So there is a pressure, I think, on the West in general to be able to defend against AI capable enemies of all kind, and also to create the norms and the standards for AI, and try to make them consistent with the democratic values. And here there is, again, I think, a role for NATO to play.
You've both mentioned a little bit about challenges that NATO faces in pursuing AI capabilities. And I wonder here whether we could expand on that a little bit. I mean, this is already a challenging thing for nation state governments to address and to harness. So I'd imagine that within the alliance, there'd be an extra level of added complexity as well. Can we talk a little bit about that?
I think you raise an interesting point here, and that is, I think, what we're going to see over the next couple of years is pursuing different AI strategies out of political considerations, but also because of strategic reasons in one way or the other. Some countries are probably going to see AI as more crucially important than others. That's perhaps due to the particular strategic culture of that one country or the other. Just look at how France, for example, and Germany look differently at artificial intelligence and the use of artificial intelligence in future warfighting. And I think one big challenge in that regard is going to be interoperability. I know that's sort of a fetish within NATO countries. Interoperability in one way, right, is seen almost like as an end goal itself. It can never be an end goal, right? It's just a stepping stone towards more better military effectiveness in the event of a conflict, right? But also in terms of propping up conventional deterrence, of course, vis-a-vis potential adversaries and so forth. But I do think there are going to be some big interoperability challenges, and that brings me back to my original point. I think that is, rather than try to focus on something really, really large, or something, an overarching architecture when it comes to artificial intelligence, I think it's important perhaps to break it up into different components and really specifically focus on one sector, for example, logistics, and see what can we do with machine learning algorithms and logistics. What kind of private partnerships can we bring on board here? And some of this is already happening to a certain degree, because I think in that field, for example, I see huge potential, and you can start, or you can just amplify, expand on what you're doing in that field already. The other big part, again, would be predictive maintenance, and really trying to figure out perhaps some sort of common operating procedures when it comes to predictive maintenance, and certain platforms such as the F-35, right, or the Eurofighter among NATO allies. Just because it's a widely used aerial platform. The same goes for certain main battle tanks and so forth. So I think there's a lot of potential there, without it having to be too political, as would be the case if you would grandiosely announce a big AI initiative or strategy at the NATO level, I think.
I do agree with Franz that interoperability is a really important point here. And I think that the idea of having a discussion about defining common technical standards in the early stages of the designing and engineering of AI systems could reduce the cost in the future for adapting the equipment and procedures to make them compatible to work together. It is inevitable that without a strategy for future interoperability, the innovation gap among allies' capabilities can be huge. And so countries are now, as Frank was saying, adopting different strategies, and some are reluctant to include defense applications via national strategies. And there is so a problem about strategies, but also about adaptation and integration in existing equipment, and also in the culture that might be resistant to changes. So I think that it is important to try and reach a high-level understanding and common thinking about these matters, and having a top-down approach on specific aspects of this issue. But I think that this is not only the challenge for NATO. There are many other challenges, and one of those, I think, it is that at the moment it is the private sector leading on AI research, and so innovation is being carried out by startups, non-defense companies that have never worked in defense or have no wish to do so because it is too bureaucratic. And so facilitating the influx of AI technology from the private sector into the armed forces is crucial. But obviously it is difficult to drive talents in the defense research and adopt applications which are already available in the private sector into the defense. So the point is now for NATO to find ways to engage with non-traditional contractors, and also address concerns like exposure of intellectual property of algorithms for dual use technology. And another important challenge to be addressed, I believe, it is that AI in defense poses very complex problems, ethical, legal, policy pitfalls, and this includes the possible manipulation of data, but also the possible vulnerability of AI in national security critical systems. For example, AI is generating many concerns and a vast debate on how this could affect nuclear weapon systems, and so NATO's nuclear stability. Because, in particular, for example, the modernization of nuclear weapon systems with AI application may introduce new vulnerabilities that have not yet been foreseen, and so this could undermine the ability to launch nuclear weapons, or in general, the ability to have a credible deterrence, and so and prevent a nuclear crisis escalation.
What I think is really, really fascinating listening to both of you talk about some of these challenges, that they are exactly the same challenges that countries like China face, which might be surprising to certain listeners of the podcast as well, who might have seen a lot of reporting on how advanced China's use of AI is at the moment. I mean, focusing on using AI to fix problems like defense mobilization and logistics is a focus of theirs. How to work more closely with the private sector is still a question as well within the military civil fusion policy that Xi Jinping has implemented at national level. So all of these things I think are echoed in other countries' experiences as well. But maybe to end, and we're nearing the end of our time here, what do you think NATO has done so far to turn its ambition into reality, and what do you think it should be focusing on in the short term?
Within NATO, some allies are driving the innovation effort, but also at the NATO level, NATO increased the defense budget across the alliance, and and agreed that 20% of NATO budget are allocated on investments on new technologies. Also, AI efforts are not only resource intensive, it is also about strategy, and so NATO is trying to put forward some strategies. And already in December 2019, during the London meeting, the allies agreed to develop a roadmap for NATO's response to emerging and disruptive technologies, and this includes artificial intelligence. And in February this year, during the NATO defense ministers meeting, it was agreed coherent implementation strategy for this roadmap. A specific NATO AI strategy should emerge before summer 2021, and should also provide a platform to test whether AI military applications of the allies are up to NATO standards, but also to set ethical guidelines to ensure that humans are always accountable and responsible for AI systems. And there are many other initiatives. There is a new NATO Innovation Unit in Brussels, which are leading on various collaborative activities and experimental projects. There is a new advisory group which provides outside expertise, and the NATO Secretary General has also proposed a NATO Defense Innovation Initiative that will be discussed at the next NATO summit this year, and intends to help transatlantic cooperation in that sector. And honestly, I believe that emerging technologies and AI will be at the center of the next NATO summit in Brussels.
It's a great question, and perhaps let me be slightly controversial towards the end here and to say that artificial intelligence in general, right, is a general purpose technology, sort of like the combustion engine, right, as one scholar once called it. So, in a sense, down the road, I don't think NATO will have a specific AI strategy or is going to be specifically focused AI, to the degree that it's not going to be specifically focused on combustion engines, right, in the future. In a sense, it's going to be so ubiquitous, this technology, that it's going to be everywhere, and it's going to be used for a lot of other capabilities. So it's really an enabling technological capability. You're going to see it in cyber, you're going to see it in all the other domains, air, sea, land, and so forth, space, right? So I think what NATO should do is really move away from this idea that this is a very specific capability that needs to be had, and really try to apply it to already existing deliberations and concepts. For example, there's a big doctrinal debate in NATO right now, the biggest one, I think, over the last 3 decades, really. NATO, the United States, and the UK is really moving in this direction of all domain or multi-domain operations. That is really the integration of different domains for future warfighting. And here, artificial intelligence is sort of like one of the crucial underpinnings that ties this concept really together. So I would really specifically look into to what degree artificial intelligence or machine learning algorithms can really support or amplify the success of this concept once it's actually going to be adopted into official doctrine in a few years down the road. And specifically, I'm talking about command and control capabilities or decision support mechanisms for senior military commanders, because I think this brings me back to my original point. It cannot happen really until this trust issue is addressed. And I think this is something where there's a technical component that needs to be addressed here, but then also an organizational and structural component here. And I think at the end of the day, the most important aspect in all of these technological adaptations is, of course, leadership. You need bold leadership at NATO level, among the military, but also among politicians, to really make this a reality and integrate artificial intelligence into all of these operations and into NATO at all levels, I think.
Erica, last point.
I just wanted to add something on what Franz said, that even if it is not much into details, the fact that NATO wants to put forward a strategy at NATO level might be important, because NATO wants to be the platform to foster this cooperation among allies, because there are many other international bilateral initiatives at the moment. And so NATO wants to play a role and wants to bring the discussion about the establishment of common standards in the early stages. And I think that this can help also because NATO is an alliance made of 30 countries, and even though there is no legislative power, head of states meet regularly in summits, political leaders, military leaders, and commanders meet and agree on defense planning and spending. And as Franz was saying, the leadership role is really important here to accelerate the discussion and provide maybe a framework, even if broad, for the AI application in defense.
Yeah, those are both really, really good points. Look, we've run out of time and we've only scratched the surface of this topic. So I'm sure that we'll pick this up and delve into greater detail at another stage. I want to thank you both for your insightful conversations and look forward to having you on the podcast again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to all our listeners. We hope you enjoyed the episode as well. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. For more in-depth analysis of the key international security and defense issues from around the world, be sure to follow the IISS on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit the IISS website. Thank you and see you next time.